Sturgeon Lake, near Bobcaygeon, Ontario. A Tuesday evening in August, 1956, quarter to 7. Irene Bellamy, 38, out of Peterborough, stood at the end of a rented dock with her daughter Faye, 7, pressed against her side, and had stopped setting the supper table 10 minutes earlier to do something she had not been taught to do and could not have explained. Listen for one particular motor inside a lake full of other people's motors. Her husband Walter and their son Tommy, 11, had gone out at 4 o'clock. It was now nearly 7. 2 cabins down, she could hear Marjorie Halverson doing exactly the same thing, standing at her own dock's edge, facing the same stretch of open water, waiting on the same specific sound. Irene had grown up nowhere near a lake. She had married into this, into 2 weeks every August at a cabin she and Walter did not own, paid for out of what Walter's wages at the Peterborough foundry could spare, on a lake she had first seen the summer she was 26. 6 Augusts in, she could now do the thing Marjorie Halverson could do, and the thing every other woman standing at every other dock along this shore at quarter to 7 could do. She could tell her husband's borrowed outboard from the 4 or 5 others crossing the bay, before she could see the boat, before Tommy's shape was visible at the bow. She could not have said which detail told her, the pitch, the rhythm, some unnamed thing worn into her ear over 6 identical Augusts. She only knew that when the sound resolved out of the general engine noise of the lake, something in her chest resolved with it. Faye tugged her hand. "Is that them?" Irene did not answer right away. She was still listening, not for whether it was them, which she already knew, but for something else in the sound she had never once tried to name. What, exactly, was Irene Bellamy listening for in a motor she couldn't yet see? And why had 6 identical August evenings taught a woman who had grown up nowhere near water to read a lake the way her own daughter had never had to learn? A rented Kawartha dock in the mid-1950s was built to do one obvious job, and one job nobody wrote into the rental agreement. The obvious job: a place to tie a boat, launch a canoe, dip water for the kettle. The unwritten job: a stage. Every dock along this shore had, by unspoken agreement among the families renting them, a section given over to a plank cleaning table, a hand scale nailed or clamped to a post, and enough clear space for whoever came in off the water to be seen coming in, not slipped quietly ashore, but arrived, in full view of whichever cabins had a line of sight to that particular dock. This mattered because the day's fishing, for a family like the Bellamys, was the one part of the vacation that happened entirely out of anyone else's sight. Walter and Tommy left after lunch, and were not seen again until the boat rounded the point. Whatever had actually happened out on the water, the strikes, the lost fish, the long silent hour when nothing happened at all, existed only as Walter's and Tommy's word, until the boat reached the dock, and the evidence came ashore, where Irene, Faye, and anyone else on the shore that evening could see it weighed, counted, and laid out. The dock's cleaning table was not incidental to the ritual. It was the ritual's courtroom, and its stage was the same 12 feet of plank. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of the Canadian cottage and campfire summer between 1920 and 1980. What the cabin was, what the campfire or the fishing trip or the dock conversation gave the family who kept the ritual, and what they were actually building when they came back to the same lake summer after summer. Not nostalgia for old photographs, the documented social meaning of a ritual that a generation of Canadian families arranged their year around. Even if you've never held a fishing rod, this is about the specific way a family turns one ordinary day's work into the story it tells about itself. And if you spent your summers at a lake like this, or your family did, put it in the comments. Did your family have a lake where the day's catch got weighed on the dock before supper? And do you remember whose fish story grew the most by the time it reached the fire? Next time, we follow a Canadian family into the dark for the dock conversation that only ever happened once the younger children were asleep. Back to the fire. What exactly was required of Walter Bellamy? What had to happen at that cleaning table? In what order, before the day's fishing counted as told? What Irene Bellamy was actually listening for, underneath the simple fact of the boat's return, was the answer to a question she never asked out loud. Had it been a good day or a long one? She had learned, over 6 Augusts, that she could often tell before the boat was even in sight, from how fast it was traveling, whether Walter cut the motor early to drift the last stretch or came straight in at full throttle, whether Tommy was standing up in the bow craning to be seen or sitting low and quiet. A fast, straight approach with a boy standing up usually meant something worth weighing. A slow, quiet drift in usually meant an empty pail and a story about the one that got away, told a little too carefully. Tonight it was the fast approach. Tommy was on his feet before the boat had fully slowed, one hand already braced on the gunwale, and Irene felt the specific, familiar lift in her chest that she'd stopped trying to name years ago. Walter cut the motor a boat length out and let the last of the way carry them in, and Tommy called across the closing water before the bow had even touched the dock. Not the number, never the number first, but Dad let me net the big one, which told Irene everything she needed to know about how the afternoon had actually gone between a father and a son who otherwise had very little reason, across the other 50 weeks of the year, to be the only two people in a boat together for 3 straight hours. This was the part of the ritual that had nothing to do with fish. A foundry machinist and an 11-year-old boy did not, in the ordinary run of a Peterborough winter, have 3 uninterrupted hours, in which nothing was expected of either of them except to sit in the same small space and wait. The lake had manufactured that time out of nothing but distance and patience, and handed it to a father and son who would not otherwise have known what to do with it, or where to find it. What happened next, as Walter passed the stringer up to Tommy's waiting hands and the boat's hull finally touched the dock, was the part of the evening that made the whole afternoon official. What happened at the cleaning table was not, strictly, necessary. A family could have brought the fish ashore, cleaned them out of sight in the cabin's small kitchen, and eaten them without ceremony. That some families did exactly that, and were quietly understood by their dock neighbors to be missing something, is itself documented in the region's cottage tourism social history. Family-oriented Kawartha vacationing developed its customs in full public view, on shared shorelines where a rented dock's activity was visible to every other rented dock nearby. The cleaning table, the scale, and the specific unhurried pace at which Walter worked the fillet knife were not private kitchen tasks moved outdoors for convenience. They were a family's evidence, presented. Walter hung the largest fish on the scale first, always the largest first. This was understood without being stated, and let the needle settle before he said the number out loud, and only then, not before. Tommy stood close enough to read the dial himself, which was, this particular August, new. Last summer he had only been allowed to hold the stringer. 2 summers before that, he had not been allowed past the second dock plank at all. The right to stand at the scale and read the number aloud before your father did was not assigned by age alone. It was earned, 1 August at a time, the same way a man's fillet knife was earned before it was handed down. Marjorie Halverson called something across the water from her own dock, a number, a question, a comparison to whatever her own husband had brought in that afternoon, and Walter called something back without looking up from the knife. This was its own small institution. Results were not kept private between docks. A good day was announced, casually and without boasting, to whichever neighbor happened to be within earshot, and a bad day was announced with the same casualness, because the alternative, silence, no report at all, would have said more than any number could. By the time the last fish was weighed, cleaned, and wrapped in newspaper for the icebox, the facts of the day had been fully established: what was caught, where, on what, and by whose hand at the crucial moment. What remained, and what would not happen at the cleaning table, no matter how long the fish took to clean, was the telling of it. Supper came first, and supper was quiet. The day's fish, fried plain, eaten at the oilcloth table with the specific, unceremonious hunger of people who had been outdoors since noon. It was only after the plates were cleared and the light outside had gone from gold to blue that the day's fishing actually became a story, told at the fire Walter built on the sand a few yards up from the dock. And it was only there, at the fire, that the numbers established an hour earlier at the scale were allowed to start changing. This was understood by everyone present, including the children, as a kind of sanctioned exaggeration rather than dishonesty. The scale had already told the truth. The fire was for something else, for the version of the afternoon that made the waiting worthwhile, the version where the big one had nearly gotten away twice, where Tommy's network at the crucial moment had been more heroic with each retelling, where a fish that the scale had put at just under 3 pounds acquired, somewhere between the third and fourth telling, a fight worthy of something twice its size. Faye, 7, laughed at the same exaggerated gesture, Walter's 2 hands spreading wider each time he described the fish's length, every single night, because the exaggeration was not the joke. The ritual of watching her father's hands spread a little further than the night before was the joke, and she was in on it, and being in on it was exactly the point. This was the fire's actual function on a fishing family evening, distinct from its function on nights when nothing had been caught. It was where the day's private labor, already verified once at the scale, was converted into the family's shared property, a story now belonging to Irene and Faye as much as to the two who had actually been on the water, told and retold until a 9-year-old memory of a Tuesday in August could be produced, word for word, gesture for gesture, decades later, by someone who had not been born yet when it happened the first time. What the fire gave a family like the Bellamys, evening after evening, was not entertainment. It was the mechanism by which one household's private day became one household's permanent memory, and neither the cleaning table nor the fire alone could have done that job. It took both, in that order, every single night. But the cleaning table and the fire circle were not identical up and down this shore. What Walter Bellamy did with a rented dock and a borrowed boat, a family with an owned cottage 2 lakes over, was doing with a rather different set of tools. And that difference had a name. The Bellamy's 2 weeks belonged to a specific and documented category of Kawartha cottage life. The rented cabin, paid for by the week, on a lake where ownership and rental sat side by side on the same shoreline, without much comment. Regional tourism history records this pattern directly. Operations like Hamilton Cottages, built beginning in 1945 by a carpenter and a schoolteacher, renting out 4 small units to supplement their income, becoming a documented template for exactly this kind of family. Not wealthy, not vacationing at a resort with a dining room and staff, but paying a working family's wages for 2 weeks of a dock, a rowboat or small outboard, and a plank cabin with a wood or kerosene stove. An owned cottage 2 lakes over changed almost nothing about the fishing itself, and nearly everything about what the dock ritual meant. A family that owned its cabin owned its scale too, the same scale, hung on the same nail, every single August, weighing fish against a private, unbroken decade of prior summers that a renting family could not access in the same way. Walter Bellamy's scale was the cabin's, not the Bellamy's. It had hung on that post for whichever families had rented this dock before them, and would hang there next August for whoever rented it next. The ritual he built with it was no less real for that, but it was rebuilt from nothing, week to week, rather than inherited whole from a father who had once stood exactly where Walter now stood, on exactly this dock, with exactly this scale. This was, without needing to be stated by anyone at the lake, the class geography of Kawartha cottage country in the 1950s. Not a hard line between rich and poor, but a soft and well understood distinction between families whose evening ritual was continuous with 30 prior Augusts, and families, like the Bellamys, who built the same ritual freshly each summer, on rented equipment, and let it be no less theirs for the 2 weeks it lasted. The dock did not care which kind of family stood on it. It performed the identical function for both, courtroom, then stage, every single evening, regardless of whose name was on the rental receipt. None of this, the rented dock, the borrowed boat, the 2 predictable weeks in August, was possible for a family like the Bellamys a generation earlier, and the reason was not custom, but infrastructure. The rail branch that reached Bobcaygeon in 1904 and the completion of the Trent-Severn Waterway in 1920 had opened the Kawarthas to organized resort tourism decades before Walter Bellamy was born. But that access served visitors who could afford a train ticket, a porter, and a week at a resort hotel with a dining room. A Peterborough foundry machinist's family, in the 1920s or early 1930s, did not fit that access model at all. The lake existed, the means to reach it easily, for a family like this one, did not yet exist. What changed that, over the following 2 decades, was the road. Highway 35 was first assumed as a provincial route in 1931, but through the 1930s, much of it remained gravel, paved only in short disconnected sections. Cameron to Fenelon Falls by 1938, a stretch north from Dwight in 1940, the kind of surface that made a summer drive slow, dusty, and hard on a family car's tires. The section from Lindsay north to Norland was fully paved through the 1940s. It was only from 1954 onward that pavement pushed north from Norland toward Minden and the edge of the Halliburton Highlands, finally making the district reliably reachable by an ordinary family automobile rather than by rail ticket and resort booking. This is the specific and documented reason a family like the Bellamys could rent a cabin for 2 weeks in August 1956 and simply drive there on a Saturday morning, not because Kawartha cottage culture was new, but because the road that made it affordable to a working family was, in the timeline of the ritual itself, barely 2 years old. What Walter Bellamy experienced as an unremarkable Saturday morning drive north out of Peterborough was one province highway paving season earlier, not yet a trip his own family could have made in a single day at all. The same road system that carried the Bellamys to Sturgeon Lake in 1956 would, within another decade and a half, carry something else north behind it. Equipment that would quietly finish the job of changing what a family's evening on the water actually looked like. The equipment that reached Sturgeon Lake over the following 15 years did not arrive to destroy anything. It arrived to make fishing more efficient. And it did exactly that. Through the 1950s, a boat's only depth finder was an anchor let down on a measured length of rope. When the anchor struck rock instead of mud, an angler knew the bottom had changed, and that this was worth exploring. Reading a lake, in Walter Bellamy's evening, meant reading the water itself, current, color, the behavior of other boats, 30 years of a father's accumulated instinct, passed down rod length by rod length. The first commercially available fish finder, Lawrence's Fish Locator, reached the market only in 1957 and remained uncommon through most of the following decade. Fiberglass hulls, lighter and cheaper to maintain than wood, did not meaningfully replace the region's wooden fishing boats until the 1960s and 1970s. What Sonar and fiberglass gave the fishing families who came after the Bellamys was real. Faster boats, more consistent catches, less guesswork, fewer wasted afternoons on empty water. What they did not give, and were never built to give, was a reason for the catch to still need retelling once it was known in advance, on a screen, before the boat ever left the dock. A sonar unit could show a family where the fish were. It could not manufacture the 3 hours of enforced, undistracted waiting that had once been the actual point. The Bellamy's cottage country routine had one more decade of ordinary life left in it after that August of 1956, before the region's fishing culture began to modernize around it. By the mid 1960s, evening catches were increasingly documented with a camera instead of at the fire. The fish held up for a photograph rather than weighed and argued over, the photograph itself becoming the family's evidence in place of the retelling. Sturgeon Lake's rented docks are mostly still there. Some still have a scale bolted to a post, out of habit more than necessity now. What the scale and the fire gave the Bellamys, a family's private day, converted, one August evening at a time, into a story that belonged to all four of them equally. What the camera and, later, the sonar screen gave the families who came after, a faster, more reliable, and considerably less collaborative version of exactly the same afternoon. Irene Bellamy did not know, in August of 1956, that she was listening for something that a piece of electronic equipment would, within 20 years, be able to tell her before the boat was even visible. She only knew that the sound resolving out of the lake's general noise, and the particular lift in her chest when it did, was worth 6 identical Augusts of learning how to hear. No sonar screen was ever built to give a family that. If this channel is going to keep documenting what the Canadian cottage summer meant to the people who made it their yearly ritual, subscribe. There are more lakes, more campfires, more fishing trips at dawn, and more quiet nights on the dock that were the best part of someone's whole year, and were never described that way at the time, because they didn't need to be. Even if you've never held a fishing rod, this is about the specific way a family turns one ordinary day's work into the story it tells about itself. And if you have a memory of a cabin, a campfire, a song, a fishing trip, a sky full of stars over a lake, put it in the comments. Did your family have a lake where the day's catch got weighed on the dock before supper? And do you remember whose fish story grew the most by the time it reached the fire? Next time, we follow a Canadian family into the dark for the dock conversation that only ever happened once the younger children were asleep. Back to the fire.